If you look at the raw mathematical probability of a child surviving 50,000 years ago without two living parents, the number you arrive at is effectively zero. In a world of nomadic wandering, apex predators, and zero margin for error calorie counting, a human infant is the most expensive, most fragile, and most useless asset a group can carry. To the cold eye of a mathematician, an orphan in the Upper Paleolithic was a dead weight that should have been cut loose within hours. And yet, and this is the part that should keep you up tonight, the genetic record tells a completely different story. We have found the remains of children from the deep past who survived for years despite being born into impossible circumstances. Imagine a small, shivering child in a dark cave, pressing a thumb stained with red ochre against a cold limestone wall. That thumbprint shouldn't exist. By every law of the wild, that child should have been a ghost before the ochre even dried, but they weren't. We are the descendants of the people who looked at a 0% survival rate and decided to fight the math. It makes you wonder what we've lost in the transition to the modern world. The first thing we have to do is dismantle the Spartan delusion. Most of us have the cinematic image of ancient humans as brutal, hyper-utilitarian survivalists who would leave a crying baby behind the moment things got tough, as if our ancestors were just hairier versions of a bad action movie villain. We assume that because life was hard, people must have been hard. It's a logical leap, but it's one that falls apart the second you look at the dirt. Archaeology is a blunt instrument, but it's an honest one. When we dig, we don't find evidence of a society that discarded the weak. We find the opposite. We find the bioarchaeology of care, a field popularized by researcher Lorna Tilley around 2015, which uses skeletal remains to prove that ancient humans were providing intensive, long-term medical and social support to individuals who couldn't contribute a single calorie to the group. If ancient humans were the ruthless survival of the fittest caricatures we imagine, orphans would have disappeared from the fossil record immediately. But they didn't, which, let's be honest, suggests our ancestors might have been more human than we are currently. The myth of the cold-blooded caveman is a modern invention we use to justify our own lack of community. We like to think we're the first ones to discover compassion, because it makes our current isolation feel like progress. But the reality of the Paleolithic was that you didn't survive because you were the strongest individual, you survived because you were part of a group that refused to let you fail. If an orphan died back then, it wasn't because the group decided they weren't worth the effort, it was because the entire group was already starving to death. The orphan was the canary in the coal mine, not a sacrificial lamb. This realization changes the stakes of the question entirely. We aren't asking how orphans survived, we're asking why the group was so willing to risk its own life to keep them. To understand how this worked in practice, we have to look at the Ife pygmies of the Ituri forest. In 1992, Edward Tronick published a study that effectively broke the modern psychological model of the mother. In the Western world, we have this obsessive, almost pathological focus on the biological mother-infant bond as the only thing that matters. But Tronick found that Ife infants were handled by someone other than their mother within hours of birth. By the time they were 6 months old, these infants were being cared for by an average of 14 different people. As if one mother wasn't already exhausted enough, the EFL decided it took a literal dozen-plus people just to get through a Tuesday. This isn't just babysitting, this is a fundamental structural reality called alloparenting. When we talk about orphans in the ancient world, we are making a mistake by assuming the word orphan meant the same thing to them as it does to us. In our world, an orphan is someone who has lost their primary caregivers and is now outside the system. In the world of the Ife, and by extension our ancestors, there was no outside. The child was already being fed, held, and taught by 10 or 20 different adults. If a biological mother died, the child didn't suddenly find themselves in the arms of a stranger. They were already in the arms they had known since birth. The system was designed to be redundant. It was a fail-safe. The death of a parent was a tragedy, but it wasn't a structural collapse. The allo-mothers, the aunts, the grandmothers, the older siblings, and even the unrelated neighbors simply closed the gap. It was an automated absorption. But that leads to an even darker question. Why would a non-relative take on that burden, when every extra mouth to feed could mean the difference between life and death for their own biological children? The answer might lie in the grandmother hypothesis, a theory championed by Kristen Hawkes after her work with the Hadza people in Tanzania. Most mammals reproduce until they die, but human females live for decades after they can no longer have children. From an evolutionary standpoint, that makes no sense unless those grandmothers are the secret weapon for orphan survival. Hawkes noticed that among the Hadza, the work of grandmothers in foraging for tubers and hard-to-reach calories was the primary factor in whether a child thrived. Think of it as the original social security system, but with more digging and fewer spreadsheets. When a mother is busy with a new infant, she can't provide enough calories for her older children. The grandmother steps in. But what happens if the mother isn't there at all? The grandmother becomes the primary survival engine. In the ancient world, a grandmother wasn't just a relative, she was a biological insurance policy. The data from the Hadza suggests that children with living maternal grandmothers have significantly higher survival rates in times of crisis. This isn't just about love, it's about the fact that grandmothers have the knowledge and the time that parents simply don't. They know where the water is when the springs dry up. They know which roots are edible during a frost. They are the repository of the group's How to Not Die manual. But even a grandmother can't do it alone. The math of survival requires more than just one extra pair of hands. It requires a level of cooperation that seems almost alien to our modern, individualistic brains. And that's where the archaeology starts to get really uncomfortable for those who believe in a brutal past. Let's look at the actual bones. In 2015, the bioarchaeology of care model was applied to a specific set of remains known as La Ferraci 1, a Neanderthal skeleton. Now I know what you're thinking. Neanderthals aren't us, but they are the closest mirror we have. At the La Ferraci site in France, researchers found the remains of several children, including infants. The way these children were buried suggests a level of ritual and care that was previously thought impossible for primitive species. But more importantly, we have found remains like the Shanidar 1 skeleton in Iraq. This was an individual who survived into his 40s, an old man for the time despite having a crushed skull, a withered arm, and being nearly blind, which, given the terrain, meant he couldn't have walked, let alone hunted, for most of his life. Someone carried him, someone fed him, for decades. If our ancestors and their cousins were willing to put that much effort into a disabled adult, imagine the effort they put into a child. A child is a potential asset. A disabled adult is a pure caloric drain. Yet they did it. This proves that the utility of a person wasn't the only thing that mattered. There was a social glue, a narrative of the group that required them to care for their own. In the case of an orphan, this care wasn't just a moral choice, it was a psychological necessity. If you are the kind of group that abandons its orphans, you are the kind of group that eventually abandons its elderly, its wounded, and its sick. And a group that abandons its members is a group that falls apart under the first sign of pressure. Resilience isn't found in the strength of the individual. It's found in the density of the network. If the network has holes, everyone eventually falls through. This brings us to the most comprehensive look at this phenomenon to date. The 2023 Cambridge University review led by Nikhil Chaudhuri and Salali. They didn't just look at one group, they looked at child-rearing data across a massive spectrum of hunter-gatherer societies. What they found was a startling level of non-parental care. In these societies, children are in physical contact with someone, not necessarily a parent, for up to 90% of the day. Compare that to a modern Western child who might spend hours in a plastic crib or a motorized swing. The researchers found that alloparenting isn't a backup plan. It is the plan. The study showed that in many of these groups, the biological parents provided less than half of the total care. The rest was a communal pool. This means that if a parent died, the child's care budget only dropped by 30 or 40%. In a modern nuclear family, if a parent dies, the care budget drops by 50 or 100%. The ancient world was structurally safer for orphans than the modern world is. The Cambridge study explicitly points out that our modern nuclear family setup is a bizarre recent experiment that goes against millions of years of human evolution. We have traded a robust, redundant network of care for a fragile two-person system that collapses the moment tragedy strikes. We call this privacy or independence, but to an ancient human, it would look like a suicide pact. The orphan in the Paleolithic didn't need a foster care system because they were already living in a permanent state of communal fostering. But there's a catch. This system only works if the group stays small. Once you get too big, the math of kindness begins to break. There is a dark side to this survival story, one that we rarely talk about. While the group would do everything in its power to save an orphan, that power had limits. If a group was truly starving, not "I forgot to go to the grocery store" starving, but "we haven't seen a mammoth in 3 weeks" starving, the hierarchy of survival became ruthless. We have isotopic evidence from ancient teeth that tells us when a child was weaned and what they were eating. In some cases, we see stress lines in the enamel, known as hypoplasias, which act like tree rings for trauma. We can see the exact moments when the food ran out. For an orphan, these moments were the ultimate test. While the group might want to feed everyone, the milk of a nursing mother is a finite resource. If there wasn't a surrogate mother with enough surplus milk, an infant orphan's chances plummeted, unless, as some researchers suggest, ancient humans practiced cross-nursing as a matter of course. We have to accept the reality that many orphans didn't make it. But here is the critical distinction. They didn't die because of a lack of will. They died because of a lack of resources. The intention of the group was always toward life, This is confirmed by the way we find children buried. We don't find orphans tossed into the trash, we find them laid to rest with grave goods, beads, tools, and red ochre. Even in death, they were treated as full, valuable members of the tribe. They were loved. And in the brutal world of the Ice Age, love was a luxury that had to be paid for in blood and calories. Which leads us to the biggest reveal of all, the one that redefines what it means to be human. If you look at our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, you see something terrifying. When a chimp mother dies, the orphan is almost always doomed. While there are rare cases of adoption by males or other females, it is the exception, not the rule. Most chimps will actively ignore or even attack an orphan. They lack the alloparenting instinct. But humans, we have it in our marrow. Sarah Blafer Hardy argues in her book Mothers and Others that this specific trait, the ability to care for someone else's child, is the very thing that allowed our brains to grow so large. Big brains require a massive amount of energy and a very long childhood to develop. A single mother cannot provide enough energy to raise a big-brained human infant on her own. It's physically impossible. Therefore, we could only become human once we developed the social structures to raise orphans. We didn't develop compassion because we were smart. We got smart because we developed compassion. The orphan is not a side story in human evolution. The orphan is the reason we have the cognitive capacity to even ask these questions. If we hadn't learned to look at a child that wasn't ours and say, "I will keep you alive," we would still be swinging from branches and eating fruit. Our humanity is literally built on the foundation of the adopted child, which is a much more beautiful origin story than anything you'll find in a textbook. We are the cooperative breeding ape. That is our defining biological characteristic. But this brings us back to the present and the chilling reality of how far we've drifted. We live in a world where we have more resources than any of our ancestors could have dreamed of. We have silos of grain, climate-controlled houses, and advanced medicine. And yet, the orphan in our society is often more isolated than they were in a cave 30,000 years ago. We have outsourced the alloparenting instinct to bureaucracies and state institutions. We have traded the grandmother for the social worker and the allo-mother for the foster care system. The 2023 Cambridge study ended with a subtle but devastating critique of modern life. It noted that the structural buffering of ancient societies, the way the group automatically absorbed loss, is completely missing from the modern world. Today, if a child loses their parents, their entire life is uprooted. They are moved to new houses, new schools, and new caregivers who are often strangers. We have created a world where an orphan is defined by their loss, whereas in the ancient world, an orphan was defined by their belonging. The case closed on ancient orphans isn't that they were lucky, it's that they were part of a system that didn't have a word for orphan because the group was the parent. We have solved the resource problem of survival, but we have completely failed the connection problem. We are the richest humans to ever live, and yet we are the most likely to let a child feel alone. Think back to that image from the beginning. The small child in the cave, the one pressing their thumb against the wall. We used to look at that red ochre thumbprint as a sign of a primitive, desperate life. We saw the hand of a child who was probably hungry, cold, and scared. But the science tells us we were looking at it the wrong way. That thumbprint isn't a sign of desperation. It's a sign of victory. It's a message sent across 50,000 years, reminding us that someone went into that cave with that child. Someone carried the ochre. Someone held the torch so the child could see the wall. Someone made sure that child had enough food in their belly to have the energy to play, to create, and to leave a mark. That red ochre isn't just pigment, it's a physical manifestation of a promise. It's the evidence that our ancestors refused to let the math of the wild dictate the value of a life. They looked at the useless orphan and saw the future. And they were right, because that child survived, and their children survived, and eventually you were born. You are the living proof that the impossible survival of the orphan was the most successful strategy in history. But as we look at our own world, a world of screens, fences, and isolated nuclear families, you have to wonder, if we were the ones in that cave today, would we still have the strength to hold the torch? Or have we finally become the ruthless survivalists we always wrongly accused our ancestors of being? The thumbprint on the wall is still there, drying in the dark. It's waiting for us to remember what it actually feels like to be human, a feeling that, if we're honest, most of us haven't felt in a very long time. If the system fails today, there is no village to catch the fall. There is only the cold, hard math we once spent 50,000 years trying to defeat, and the math, as we know, never forgets. We're here because they fought it. The question is, who's left to fight it for the children of today? If the answer is no one, then we aren't just losing our history, we're losing the very thing that made us worth surviving in the first place. This is the reality of the ancient world. It wasn't a paradise, and it wasn't a utopia. It was a place of extreme violence and extreme scarcity. But in the middle of all that darkness, there was a light that we have let go dim. We look at the orphan and see a tragedy. They looked at the orphan and saw a member. They didn't have the luxury of charity, so they practiced something much more powerful: necessity. They needed that child, and the child needed them. That mutual dependence was the forge of the human spirit. Today, we don't think we need anyone. We think our money, our technology, and our independence will protect us. But the bones don't lie. Independence is a death sentence in the long run. Only the groups that held on to their orphans, the ones that passed the child from hand to hand until the danger passed, made it into the light. The rest are just dust. If you find yourself thinking about that child in the cave, don't pity them. They were held by more people in a day than many of us are held by in a month. They were never a case file or a statistic. They were a name, a face, and a future. They were the red ochre on the wall. And as you close this chapter and go back to your modern, independent life, take a look at your own thumb. Look at the lines, the unique patterns, the history written in your skin. That thumb only exists because 50,000 years ago, a group of people decided that 0% wasn't an acceptable answer. They stayed, they fed, they carried, and in the end, they won. But that victory only lasts as long as we keep the promise. If we stop being the village, we stop being the humans who left that print. And that, more than any predator or any ice age, is the real threat to our survival. The math is catching up, and this time, there might not be anyone left to hold the torch. Every human being alive is a success story of an ancient foster system. It's a heavy thought to carry, but it's also a call to action. We don't need to go back to the caves, but we do need to go back to the alloparent. We need to find the grandmothers, the aunts, and the neighbors again. We need to remember that no child is someone else's problem. Because 50,000 years ago, there were no other people's children. There were only the children of the group. And until we find our way back to that understanding, we are all just orphans wandering in the dark, waiting for a light that might never come. The red ochre is waiting. The wall is waiting. But the group is gone. And that is the most chilling discovery of all. Return now to that physical detail, that small hand-sized stone carved with a child's tooth marks, or that thumbprint of red ochre on the cave wall. In the beginning, we saw it as a symbol of hope, a sign that an orphan had been cared for and loved. But look at it again, really look at it, through the lens of everything we've just discussed. That mark isn't just a sign of ancient compassion. It is a chilling reminder of what is required to keep a human soul from flickering out. It represents a level of self-sacrifice and communal duty that our modern world has almost entirely abandoned. That thumbprint is a definitive closing argument against the way we live now. It tells us that we didn't just evolve past the need for the village, we dismantled it for the sake of a comfort that is making us fragile. The child in the cave survived because the group was a single, breathing organism. We have split that organism into 8 billion pieces. And as the dark closes in on our own era of isolation, that ochre print stands as a silent, haunting judgment. They did more with nothing than we are doing with everything. They kept the orphan alive. We are the ones who are truly alone.